On the night of December 22nd, a series of sadistic murders occurred across northern Europe, but the grotesque, unholy pattern wasn't recognized right away. There was too much compartmentalization between departments to immediately connect the forensic dots. Seemingly random attacks coalesced in suburban areas. The nighttime home invasions left all of the occupants dead, but far worse than the violent killings themselves, each of the victims were savagely mutilated and mangled. The unknown perpetrators made no effort to conceal their deeds or erase evidence. No valuables were taken. There were no sexual assaults, and no individual from infants to the elderly were spared the heinous brutality. As the respective authorities from each jurisdiction went to work, they took photos, dusted for fingerprints, and canvassed the neighborhood for relevant leads. It was rudimentary police procedure. Those were pretty much universal methods for solving murders, no matter where you live in the world. International news coverage of the senseless killing epidemic brought greater awareness to the struggling detectives. They compared notes and realized it obviously wasn't hundreds of random, unrelated incidents. As unimaginable as it might seem, there was an organized operation to attack innocent families and sadistically torture them. The sheer volume of the savagery and the widespread scope of the incidents called for greater resources. Interpol might have been the most logical organization to steward the investigation, but this was a unique situation where old-fashioned legwork was definitely needed as well. Being centralized and interagency connected certainly helped facilitate a more unified approach, but the individual departments' efforts led to the greatest progress. Interpol simply compiled the raw data from them and tried to make sense of it. That's where the greatest challenge came from. Our mobile forensic unit collected evidence at the scene. There were bloody fingerprints throughout the home and signs of a horrific struggle. All victims were killed by hand, from what we can determine so far. There were deep claw and bite marks on the bodies, and numerous broken bones from being violently gripped and squeezed. Fingers and limbs were actually torn off the torsos. I've never witnessed brutality quite like that in my 23 years on the force. I honestly don't know if I'll be able to sleep tonight. If it wasn't for the human fingerprints in the victim's blood, I'd suspect it was wild animals that mauled these poor souls. We also took numerous samples of mud on the floor and carpeting, and unbelievably, bare footprint impressions leading inside the residence, and then back outside. The shoeless maniacs who did this horrific crime were obviously powerful and unhinged psychopaths. That detailed report from one crime scene unit in the Netherlands closely matched the others in Denmark, Germany, Ireland, Poland, Sweden, and elsewhere. At first, the Interpol detectives assigned to head the investigation thought the multiple reports were accidental duplicates. Only after verifying that each of the disturbing analyses came from a different location did they realize the incredible coincidences were too similar to ignore. Further hindering the process was the upcoming holidays. Christmas was in a few days, and numerous teams were short-staffed. However, once the ritualistic murder plot was recognized, all holiday leave was canceled for local and international investigators, forensic technicians, and police officers. Everyone needed to be on full alert to defend against the organized, still unfolding terrorist movement of undetermined goal and purpose. The authorities were wise to be prepared for future attacks, but none of them could have handled knowing the truth. The following night brought just as many vicious murders as the previous. The home invasion death toll tripled, and then later quadrupled. This time, a reluctant witness came forward with jaw-dropping testimony. His claims might have been dismissed outright as delusional and the byproduct of his heavy alcohol consumption, but the Danish man offered a couple details which they couldn't ignore. I swear, they were shriveled up and brown like mummified corpses. I know how that sounds, but they wore old shriveled rags and had no shoes on their feet. I watched from the alley as one of them stumbled out of that old house on the corner. I'd heard ungodly screams coming from it, and looked around the wall to see what the hell was going on. I fully admit I'd been tossed out of the bar for fighting, but I was still sober enough to recognize a walking corpse when I saw it. That unholy thing wasn't alive. It was covered in bog mud and had a rotten noose wrapped around its decayed neck. Then I witnessed it and 3 others stagger toward the woods. They headed directly into the swamp, and I pray I never see or smell such diabolical things ever again. The highly agitated, drunken sot was interviewed extensively by the local detectives and then released. He was well known as a harmless vagrant with no prior violent offenses. Then they placed his dubious testimony into the report and shared it with Interpol. Obviously, his reliability was circumspect, but the mention of the suspects being barefoot warranted a second look. All across Europe, there had been over 4,000 of these perplexing massacres associated with the ongoing investigation. Under the dire circumstances, they couldn't really afford to discount any affidavit, no matter what the witness's blood alcohol level was. The director of Interpol instructed those local detectives to pursue the witness statement about the 4 assailants walking into the swamp. Police dogs pulled the investigators all the way up to the edge of the peat bog itself, where the musty trail went cold. There was considerable evidence to support the man's bizarre testimony, but none of them could begin to explain why the shuffling footprints ended there. To add to the mounting frustration, none of the collected fingerprints or foreign DNA at any of the crime scenes matched known suspects in the extensive criminal database. Elsewhere, the unexplained bloody rain of death repeated in over 100 terrified towns. The newest wave of massacres occurred with virtually no resistance from the civil authorities. After the first 2 nights of senseless carnage, the frustrated governments sent military patrols to the affected neighborhoods. Soldiers stationed in Germany and Ireland called upon a couple of suspicious figures coming out of wooded areas to identify themselves, but there was no response in either case. After 2 unheeded warnings, they were forced to open fire. What they discovered after the suspects were neutralized was nightmarish and unbelievable. This can't be. I've just reviewed the autopsy reports. It's ridiculous. Those bodies didn't just de-asterisk-y. Come on. There has to be a mix-up at the Processing Laboratory Records Center. The bodies of the suspects supposedly collected at the scene of those 2 incidents last night have been de-asterisk-y a long time. Look at the go*****M and post-mortem photos. They look as though they've been buried in the ground for years, and the clothing on them is unlike anything I've ever seen. The deputy chief was furious about the lack of professionalism in the organization. There was absolutely no room for screw-ups of that magnitude. People were terrified. They demanded swift action and a full return to public safety. He telephoned the information clerk involved in the records transfer and immediately fired her on the spot. She protested that the medical files she forwarded from the laboratory were accurate, despite what they depicted. But he wasn't having it. Then, on a simultaneous conference call, he demanded for the German and Irish medical examiners to resend the results of their autopsies. Both of them expressed an apologetic disdain and indignation. How dare you demand anything from us? Your once acclaimed organization is both bloated and woefully inept. The German medical examiner spat. Both Angus and I received these Bronze Age-era cadavers in place of the actual suspects you ordered us to conduct autopsies upon. We simply sent you information for the museum specimens you've provided us with. I have no idea where those ancient, moldy cadavers came from, but if this is some kind of a sick joke to evaluate our competency, I don't appreciate it. If you can get your organization under control, I'll be contacting your director to file a formal complaint. In a rare equalizing moment of karma, the deputy chief was speechless. He wasn't used to being dressed down by subordinates in the field. He was too taken aback to immediately process what was said. Once the words sank in, Sebastian was too distracted to worry about receiving a threat to his job or the petty insult. He let that go and simply sought to clarify the details. Wait, are you telling me that both of you received very old specimens that do not appear to have died last night? I'm going to get to the bottom of this immediately. Trust me. I'm going to call and speak with the soldiers who took out the suspects, and I'm also going to confirm with the processing teams at both murder scenes about the condition of the deceased bodies they packed up in the transfer bags. As soon as he ended the call with the 2 belligerent medical examiners, the deputy chief called the records clerk and apologized profusely. He acknowledged he was in the wrong and had overreacted. Then he offered her job back. If there was one thing Sebastian had learned in his storied career, it was the necessity of being earnest. He was still working on being humble with mixed results. I knew you'd be calling me because I couldn't believe what we found when we checked the suspect's vitals. The Irish sharpshooter confessed. I wouldn't believe it myself if I hadn't seen it with me own eyes, sir. I even took photos with me cell phone. I know that's not protocol, but those things, they definitely ain't human no more. They were dead, long before I pulled the trigger. His call with the German soldier who shot the assailants went pretty much the same way. The distraught man admitted he was absolutely mortified by the withered, dried-up, lifeless figures he discovered after shooting them near the woods. From the military personnel, to the medical crew who packaged the bodies up for transport, to the forensic pathologists themselves, all members of the team had acted professionally. Especially in light of the highly uncomfortable circumstances. The evidence was all there, but it required a complete dismissal of science and logic to accept the truth. The bizarre photos in the report were not the result of a bureaucratic mix-up or a hoax. The undead perpetrators of these savage killings were rising out of the nearby swamps and bogs each night on the anniversary of the winter solstice. Their apparent motive was to exact their merciless vengeance on the living descendants of their own murderers. They were the fabled bogmen who met violent ends thousands of years ago in the Bronze Age, sacrificed for unknown reasons, and then thrown into the surrounding peat bogs to rot. Ironically, the unique biology of the rich soil preserves their restless corpses. It was up to Deputy Chief and the other brave and dedicated sentinels of the front lines to stop the angry, rising souls by any means necessary. As Christmas Eve approached, Sebastian wanted to give the gift of peace and freedom from the nightly wave of terror. He organized a mass bog burning and swamp drainage program across the whole of the entire continent. Wisely and without offering an explanation, his clever purification ritual ended their bloody retaliation. Hopefully they too can now rest in peace,